In the summer of 1990, Danny Thomas made a phone call that surprised everyone who heard about it. He called the executive director of St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, which was the institution he had founded in 1962 and which had been, across the 28 years since its founding, the central organizing purpose of the last half of his professional life. More central than the television show, more central than the nightclub act, more central than the specific form of commercial success that had made him one of the most recognizable faces in American entertainment across 3 decades. He called to say that he thought the hospital was going to outlive him. He said this not in the melodramatic way of a man who is performing the awareness of his own mortality, but in the specific, practical way of a man who is assessing a situation with the same quality of clear-eyed realism he had brought to every business decision of his professional life, and who has assessed that the situation contains this specific fact, and who is communicating the fact because the fact has implications that need to be addressed. He was 79 years old. He had been having heart trouble. The heart trouble was not new. He had been living with the specific cardiovascular situation that the decades of his life had produced in his body for some years, and he had been managing it with the combination of medical attention and the specific quality of deliberate disregard for what the medical attention was recommending that men of his generation and his temperament tend to bring to the management of their own health. He said, "I want to make sure it's taken care of when I'm gone." He said it practically. He said it without the sentiment that the subject might have seemed to invite, because Danny Thomas had spent 60 years being sentimental in public and had reserved the practical intelligence for the specific private contexts where the practical intelligence was what the situation required rather than the sentimentality. The executive director listened. They talked about the endowment, about the governance structure, about the specific mechanisms by which the institution he had built would continue after the person who had built it was no longer available to sustain it by the force of his personal involvement. The call lasted approximately an hour. Danny Thomas said what he needed to say. He hung up. He was dead 9 months later. But the summer between that call and the February of 1991, when his heart finally stopped, the summer that was the last summer, though it was not fully known to be the last summer until it was over, that summer contained more than the phone call about the endowment. It contained the full accumulation of what a life of 80 years had produced, and what it had cost, and what it had built, and what it had lost, and what, in the final reckoning of a man who was making the specific kinds of calculations that the awareness of the final reckoning requires, he understood about what the 80 years had meant. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you what those 80 years contained. Not the Danny Thomas of Make Room for Daddy, though that story is part of this one. Not the Danny Thomas of the nightclubs, though the nightclubs are part of this one. Not even the Danny Thomas of St. Jude, though St. Jude is the most important part of this one. The full story. The story of what was built and what was lost, and what the building of it and the losing of it cost the man who was on the other end of the phone call in the summer of 1990, making sure the thing he had built would survive the losing of him. Come with me. We are going back to the beginning, which is not Beverly Hills and not Make Room for Daddy and not the nightclubs. The beginning is Deerfield, Michigan in the year 1912, and before that it is Lebanon, in what was then Greater Syria, and the specific origin of the Jacobs family, the family that Amos Jacobs was born into before he became Danny Thomas, is the origin that the career was organized around both expressing and transcending in the specific way of immigrant families who come to America from somewhere else and who produce children who are simultaneously the expression of where they came from and the departure from it. Amos Muziad Yakub Kairuz was born on January the 6th, 1912, in Deerfield, Michigan, though the family had come from Bachare, Lebanon, which is a mountain town in what is now northern Lebanon, and which was, in the early 20th century, part of the territory under Ottoman and then French administration. His father was Charles Jacobs, a man who had come to America and who had built, in the specific way of Lebanese American immigrant men of that era, the particular form of the American life that was available to them, organized around work and family and the Lebanese American community and the Maronite Christian faith that the family had brought from Bechare. He was the fifth of 10 children. The family was large, and it was not wealthy, and it was organized around the specific values that large, not wealthy immigrant families in Dearborn area, Michigan, in the 1920s were organized around, which included the work ethic and the faith and the specific quality of communal loyalty, the loyalty to the family and to the community and to the church, that the Lebanese American tradition instilled in its children with the thoroughness of a tradition that understood community as the primary resource in a world that was not always organized around providing Lebanese American immigrants with other resources. He was funny. This is the first fact about Amos Jacobs that the subsequent career confirms was present before the career, and that was therefore genuinely his rather than the product of professional development. He was funny in the way that some children are funny, not the funny of a child who has learned to perform humor for the approval of the adults around him, but the funny of a child who sees the world in a way that produces the observation, that produces the laugh, who has the natural timing that is either given or is not, and that no amount of instruction fully installs in someone who was not given it. He was also, from early, a person of the specific quality of determined ambition that the children of immigrant families sometimes develop, when the intelligence and the specific gifts they have are larger than the specific geography they are in can accommodate. Not the crude ambition of wanting to escape the family. He loved his family and maintained the love across his entire life in a way that was specific and consistent, and that the St. Jude story is the ultimate expression of. The ambition of knowing that the self he was in the process of becoming needed more room than Deerfield, Michigan could provide, and of moving toward the room before the room was clearly available. He began performing in his teens. He performed wherever performance was possible in the specific geography he was in. At local events, at church functions, in the specific circuit of small venue entertainment that the cities and towns of the Midwest offered to young men who could make people laugh and who were willing to do it in front of whatever audience was available. He was good at it. Not good in the way that required the audience's charity to be received as good, but good in the specific way that audiences respond to without requiring the response to be analyzed. The laugh that happens because the thing is funny and not because the performer needs it to happen. He went to Detroit. He worked the clubs. He was Amos Jacobs for this portion of the early career, performing as himself in the specific sense that the name he was given at birth was the name he was performing under. And the performing under the birth name is the specific condition of the early career before the professional name is established, and before the separation between the performer's public identity and his private origin has been fully negotiated. He married Rose Marie Casanidi in 1936. She was the daughter of a Sicilian immigrant family, and she was 20 years old and he was 24, and the marriage was the marriage that lasted 55 years, until his death in 1991, and was the marriage that the subsequent career and the subsequent philanthropy and the subsequent St. Jude story were built within and sustained by in ways that the career narrative sometimes acknowledges and sometimes does not. Rose Marie, Rosie as she was known within the family and among the people who knew them, was, across 55 years of the marriage, the specific kind of partner that the kind of life Danny Thomas built requires. Not a passive partner, not a woman who organized her existence around the support of her husband's ambitions without having her own. A woman of specific intelligence and specific strength and specific opinions about what the life they were building together should be, and what it owed the things they both cared about. She was Catholic, deeply so, in the specific way of the immigrant Catholic family that had brought the faith from Sicily, in the same way that his family had brought the Maronite faith from Lebanon. The faith was shared. The faith was, across the 55 years, one of the things that held. He became Danny Thomas. The name change was the professional decision of a man who understood that Amos Jacobs was not a name the marquee could accommodate in the way that the career he was building required a name to be accommodated. And the choosing of Danny Thomas was the specific act of nominal self-creation that performers of his era and his background, who were building careers in the mainstream entertainment industry, regularly made. The nightclubs. He was a nightclub performer for the better part of a decade, performing at clubs in Chicago and Detroit and the circuit that connected the cities of the Midwest and eventually the cities of the East Coast, building the act and building the reputation and building the specific quality of relationship with an audience that the nightclub performer builds over years of nightly performance in the specific, immediate way of live entertainment, which is different from the relationship that television builds and different from the relationship that film builds. He was, in the nightclubs, exceptional, not in the quiet way, in the loud, specific, unmistakable way of a nightclub performer who has found the thing he is best at and who is doing it in the form that requires it most completely. He was funny and he was warm, and he told stories, the specific quality of the Lebanese American storytelling tradition, the story that takes its time and builds its world and produces the laugh from the world it has built, rather than from the punchline that the setup has been constructed to deliver. He told stories about his family, about his father, about the Lebanon that he had never seen but that he carried in the specific way of second-generation immigrants who carry the origin through the stories that the first generation told. The career built in the way of careers that are built by the sustained accumulation of professional quality rather than by the single dramatic breakthrough. Not overnight, not through the single event that the mythology of career breakthroughs tends to organize itself around, but through the years of consistent, excellent work that produces the reputation, and the reputation produces the opportunity, and the opportunity produces the work. He was offered a television show, Make Room for Daddy, which premiered in 1953 and which ran, under various titles, including The Danny Thomas Show, until 1965, was the show that made Danny Thomas one of the most watched performers in American television history. The show's premise was simple. Danny Williams, a nightclub entertainer, navigating the specific comedy of domestic life between his professional commitments and his family's needs. The character was a version of himself, organized around the specific qualities of the nightclub performer's life, as the writers and the producers understood those qualities to be, and Danny Thomas inhabited the character with the naturalness of someone who is playing a version of himself, completely, without the strain that playing a character fully unlike oneself requires, because the character is built on the foundation of the actual person, and the foundation is solid. The show won Emmy Awards. It was in the top 10 of the television ratings for most of its 12-year run. It made Danny Thomas one of the most recognizable faces in America and one of the highest-earning performers in the entertainment industry. He had made the vow. The vow is the central fact of the Danny Thomas story, and I want to be careful about how I describe it because the vow has been described in ways that range from the reverently accurate to the hagiographically inflated, and the difference between those ways of describing it matters for the honest account of who Danny Thomas was and what the vow meant. Here is what is documented. He had made a vow to St. Jude Thaddeus, the patron saint of hopeless causes in the Catholic tradition. In the early period of his career, when the career was not yet established, and when the specific difficulties of building a career in entertainment were the specific difficulties that the career of a young performer in the 1940s contained. The vow was the specific form of the private devotional promise that the Catholic tradition recognizes and that the Lebanese Maronite tradition in which he was raised had made familiar to him. The promise of a specific act of gratitude and service in exchange for the specific intercession of the saint in the specific difficulty being faced. He had promised to build a shrine to St. Jude if the career was established. The career was established. He built the shrine in the form of a hospital, not in the form of a physical religious shrine, because the practical intelligence that was the other side of the devotional nature led him to understand that the specific form of the shrine that would be most pleasing to the patron saint of hopeless causes was a hospital dedicated to the treatment of sick children who had no resources to pay for the treatment. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital opened in Memphis in 1962. It was dedicated from the beginning to the treatment of children with life-threatening diseases, and specifically to the treatment of children whose families could not afford the treatment, and to the research that would eventually produce the treatments that did not yet exist. The founding principle was that no child should be denied treatment because of financial inability to pay, and the principle has been maintained continuously since 1962. The hospital is, by the assessment of the people who study such things, one of the most significant pediatric research hospitals in the world. The survival rates for the specific childhood cancers that the hospital treats have improved dramatically since 1962, in ways that the research conducted at St. Jude has directly contributed to. The hospital has, in other words, done what it was built to do, not only treated the children who came through its doors, but produced the knowledge that has allowed hospitals everywhere to treat children with those diseases with greater success. This is the thing Danny Thomas built. This is the specific form that the vow took when the vow took its form. Now let me tell you about what he lost. The losing started not with the personal losses, the career difficulties, the health, but with something that happened in 1971 that organized the emotional life of the decade that followed in a way that the public account of Danny Thomas rarely includes with the emphasis it deserves. His daughter, Marlo Thomas, became one of the most prominent feminist activists in America in the early 1970s. She was the star of That Girl, the television show that had run from 1966 to 1971, and that had been, in its specific way, one of the first television shows organized around a young woman's independent professional life rather than her domestic role. She was the producer of Free to Be You and Me, the landmark children's book and album and television special of 1974 that was organized around the specific principle that children should be free to be who they are, rather than who the gender expectations of the culture required them to be. She was her father's daughter in the specific sense that the daughter of a man who built what he built is her father's daughter. She had inherited the combination of the public warmth and the private determination, and the specific quality of using the public platform in the service of something larger than the career itself. The inheritance was real, and he recognized it. He also had complicated feelings about some of what the inheritance was producing. He was a man of his generation and his faith and his specific cultural tradition, and the specific feminism that Marlo was articulating in the early 1970s was, in some of its dimensions, in tension with the specific values of his generation and his faith and his cultural tradition. The tension was real, and it was managed in the way that families manage the tensions between generations, when the generations love each other and when the love is stronger than the tension, privately, in the conversations that the family had among themselves, rather than in the public accounts. The family has spoken about this dynamic across the years with the careful honesty of people who are being honest about something complicated rather than the uncomplicated honesty of people who are being honest about something simple. Marlo has spoken about her father's complicated initial response to some of her activism and about the subsequent evolution of his understanding and his support. Danny Thomas himself, in the interviews of the later years, acknowledged the evolution, acknowledged that he had not always understood immediately what his daughter was doing and why, and that the understanding had come with time, and that the time had produced a quality of pride in what she was doing that was uncomplicated by the complications of the early response. This is not a story of a father and daughter who were estranged. They were not estranged. The love was consistent and genuine across the whole of the relationship. It is the story of a man whose daughter's life challenged some of the values that had organized his own life, and who navigated the challenge in the specific way of men of his generation, and his faith, who love their children more than they love being right, which is to say slowly, with difficulty, and eventually with the full recognition that the love is the thing and the right is not worth the love it would cost. He had health difficulties through the 1970s and 1980s. The heart was the organ that the doctors were most concerned about, for reasons that the decades of the nightclub life, the smoking, the eating, the specific lifestyle of a nightclub performer who is performing late and eating late and sleeping irregularly and doing all of this for 40 years, had produced in the body that had been doing the performing and the eating and the sleeping irregularly. He had surgery. He recovered. He continued. The continuing was the thing about Danny Thomas that the people who knew him described with the consistency of people who are describing a quality that is genuinely characteristic rather than occasionally visible. The quality of continuing, of not stopping, of being the man who showed up and did the work regardless of what the work required or what the body was doing simultaneously. The television show ended in 1965. The nightclub appearances continued through the 1970s. He produced television and film. He was involved with the Make-A-Wish Foundation and with other charitable organizations in addition to St. Jude. He was, in the later decades, a man whose public life was organized more around the philanthropic work than around the entertainment work, in the specific way of people who have found in the philanthropic work the thing that the entertainment work was always in the service of, and who are therefore, when the entertainment work is no longer the primary commitment, more fully themselves than they were when it was. The losses. He lost friends. The friends of a man of his generation and his era died with the regularity that the deaths of one's contemporaries produce when the generation is old enough that the deaths are no longer exceptional, but simply the ongoing fact of the passage of time. He lost, through the 1970s and 1980s, the specific texture of the social world that had been the world of his peak years, the world of the Rat Pack adjacency, the world of the Las Vegas entertainers, and the specific social geography of the entertainment industry of the 1950s and 1960s that produced the particular kind of professional friendship that the era and the industry generated. He lost ground in the entertainment industry, in the specific way that the entertainers of his era lost ground as the era changed and as the entertainment that the new audiences wanted became the entertainment that had not been the entertainment of the era that had produced him. He was not unwanted. He continued to work, continued to appear, continued to be received with the warmth that his specific quality of accessible, warm, self-deprecating humor generated in audiences that had grown up with him. But the scale of the work and the specific position in the industry that he occupied in 1990 was not the scale and the position of 1960, and the difference was the specific kind of loss that time produces in careers built on the specific commercial logic of a specific era. He had built the hospital. He had built the family, Marlo and Tony and Tara, 3 children who had become, in their own right, people of professional distinction and human substance. He had maintained the marriage to Rosie for 55 years. He had kept the faith. And in the summer of 1990, making the phone call about the endowment, he was a man who was assessing what he had built and what he was going to leave and what the leaving of it was going to require. He said, "I think the hospital is going to outlive me." He was right. He died on February the 6th, 1991. He was 79 years old. He died at his home in Beverly Hills. Rosie was with him. The children were with him. He died in the specific way of men who have lived the life they lived and who die in the company of the people they love, which is both the ordinary form of death and the form of death that is the best available. and which in this case was the form that the 55 years of the marriage and the decades of building the thing he built, and the specific quality of a man who had organized his life around the people and the causes he cared about, had earned. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital continues. It treats approximately 10,000 children per year. The research it conducts has contributed to survival rates for childhood cancer that were unimaginable in 1962. The operating cost of the hospital is enormous, and the funding of the operating cost is the ongoing work of the St. Jude fundraising apparatus, which includes the annual telethon and the ongoing donor relationships and the specific sustained organizational capacity of an institution that was built to last and that has lasted. He built it. He maintained it for 30 years. He made the phone call in the summer of 1990 to make sure it would continue without him. It continues. Now, my friend, let me close this with the specific reflection that the summer of 1990 requires. Danny Thomas had everything. He had the career that the vow had been made for. He had the television show that had made him one of the most watched performers in American history. He had the nightclub act that had established him as one of the finest performers of his generation in the specific form of live entertainment. He had the family, he had the hospital, he had the faith, and in the summer of 1990, he had the specific awareness of a man who is 79 years old and who has heart trouble and who has been told what the condition of his heart is, that the everything he had built was in the process of becoming the everything he was going to leave. Not losing, that is not the right word, because leaving is not the same as losing in the way that the word losing implies a failure of holding. He was going to leave it. The leaving was the form of the ending that was available to him, and it was, in the specific assessment of the summer of 1990, the ending he was making his arrangements for. He made his arrangements. He made the phone call about the endowment. He spent the summer with Rosie and with the children and with the work that the summer required. He was, by the accounts of the people around him in those final months, himself. Not diminished in the interior sense, not reduced to the contemplation of the ending, but present and engaged and warm in the way he had always been present and engaged and warm, the way that is the form that his specific quality of being in the world had always taken. He died in February. It was a winter ending rather than a summer ending, which means the summer was not the last season, but was the last summer. The last summer with the full awareness of what the phone call about the endowment was saying, and with the specific quality of a man who has made his arrangements and who is living the remaining time in the full knowledge of what the remaining time is. He had everything, and he arranged for everything to survive the losing of him. That is not the same as losing it all. That is the most complete form of having it that is available to a person. He had it in that form. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you hear about St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, in the telethon, in the commercials, in the specific way that the hospital continues to make itself known in the American cultural landscape as the place where no child is turned away, hear the story behind the name. Hear a boy from Deerfield, Michigan, whose family came from Bachar, Lebanon, who made a vow in a difficult year and who spent the rest of his life keeping it. He kept it. He kept it until the summer of 1990 and beyond, until the February of 1991 and beyond, because what he built is keeping it still. He had everything. He gave most of it away. That is who Danny Thomas was.